All right, we are going to try this again and see if we have sound. We just tried this a bit ago and didn't have any sound, so I am hoping this works. So when you join me live, if you can let me know that you have sound, that you're hearing me, please let me know in the comments. If you're not hearing me, I'm not sure what's going on. Yay. Okay, I'm getting a yay that we have sound. Hooray. So when in doubt, turn things off and turn them back on. Thank you so much for being here. If we haven't met, my name is Julie Hirschberg. I'm a neurologic physical therapist. I am the owner and founder of Reactive Therapy and Wellness. We're a neuro rehab center. We do integrated care for people with FND and many other neurologic disorders. It's why this topic today is so near and dear to me. I'm so passionate. I got a hold of this article like the week it came out, and I have been dying to talk about it. So I'm so excited. Every week I get to come here, chat with you, and share what we've been learning and doing, our whole team. And this article is something, I wish I could just sit here and read it to you all. It's so fantastic. But let me just share a picture of it here. So this came out just this year. It's called Functional Neurologic Disorder is a Feminist Issue. And I want to point out, look at all these fantastic authors, female leaders in the world of neurology, psychiatry, neuropsychiatry. They are people in healthcare who have FND. So many great people on this article. It's a review. It was in the journal Neuropsychiatry. And I wanted to give you a synopsis of this today because this, I think, is so important. We're going to talk about FND. We're going to talk about why it's a feminist issue, why it's a health equity issue, why it's not well understood, what are the historical pieces, why we need more research funding, why we need more access to care, why we need more education for healthcare providers. So there's a lot to cover today, but all on this article. So I have a copy of it here. And what the authors they just do such a great job is introducing the background of FND, the definitions, all of those pieces, because remember, their audience are people reading these journals, which are people in healthcare, which we're trying to educate about FND. And so it's such an important article, an important time for this article. So they start off with some of the background. And one of the biggest pieces that we understand in healthcare is that it's not well researched in women. Up through the 90s, like we're talking about when I was in college, women were not even in a lot of research studies for major medical conditions like Parkinson's, like heart disease, definitely not in things like FND. So women were excluded from clinical trials. And this is a really important part of the history of this disorder and many disorders and understanding them as FND or as feminist issues, So one of the things that they bring up too is this idea of implicit bias really influencing this. So there have been over time stereotypical female medical disorders, like things like chronic fatigue syndrome that we see often with FND, myalgic encephalomyelitis, anorexia, migraine. And these disorders have been historically marginalized, just like FND. So this is really in the introduction, and I think it's so important. They talk about what FND is. So if you haven't heard of FND, functional neurological disorder, it is a multi-network brain disorder. And I like that they use that word multi-network because it's within certain brain areas, and then the connections, the way the brain is communicating between different areas. And there are key areas implicated in this, including areas of emotion regulation, self-agency, interoception, motor control, autonomic, all those pieces of the pie that we typically talk about. And what we do know about FND is that it appears to be more common in women. About 70% of people with FND are women. We know this about other disorders as well, but this is true in FND. What we also know is that it can take people a very long time, like way too long, to get a diagnosis and to get treatment. They talk in the study that some patients wait a mean time of 8 years before a diagnosis is made. And we know that it's treatable. But if people don't have treatment, few people recover or get better. And so, one of the calls to action that I'll share at the end here is we need to have better access to treatment. So these are key issues in functional neurologic disorders. And one of the things that is written about a lot, I know I've studied it because it's so fascinating, is that the history of FND includes the history of maltreatment of women. And I know I've talked about this before, but using terms like hysteria, for example, is part of the history of FND, and I think really important to recognize and say, well, this is a really a lot of the treatment and diagnosis of hysteria was utterly maltreatment of women. So this is the background, the impetus for the authors to write this paper. And they say, building on the core definition of feminism as the belief that women should be afforded the same rights, power, and opportunities as men and be treated in an equitable way. The feminist approach to health and equities leads us to examine the connections between disadvantage and health and the distribution of power in the process. So I want to talk about some of the key areas that they address in this article. And one of the first ones is stigma and misrepresentation. So I talk about this a lot because I hear about it a lot from the patients that we see, is this real strong stigma that they experience in the medical field. And this is due to, in part, some of the history of FND being associated with psychiatric disorders and or misunderstood as faking or feigning symptoms, which have been shown to be totally not true. I should say the faking or feigning, the association with the psychiatric disorder can occur. It's just not the only thing that can occur in FND. So one of the biggest pieces, so there's a long history of this. In fact, I didn't learn about FND in school myself. It wasn't until later, probably about 10 years into my career that I learned about it. And there truly is a lack of teaching it in the schools. And I know I have some amazing colleagues that are starting to teach this. For the first time last year, I was teaching this at USC in our physical therapy department. But a lot of these outdated misperceptions, misunderstandings of FND may still be taught, or if they're not in the curriculum, they may actually be passed down from a clinical instructor or advisor or attending to their residents and trainees. So these are key pieces that have to change in our understanding of FND. So what are some of those old things that need to be reversed, right? So they list a few that perpetuate stigma. Number one is that FND represents a missed alternative diagnosis. And this actually, they go through the evidence here, and I've talked about this before. This just doesn't occur as often as people think, that FND is kind of like, well, we'll just throw FND out as a diagnosis. We'll put that on somebody when we can't find anything else. That doesn't seem to be the case. And FND doesn't appear to be misdiagnosed more than any other neurologic disorder. It's a very reliable diagnosis, frankly. So that's one thing that perpetuates stigma. Number two is that FND is thought of arising from this disembodied mind. And this comes from a very extreme dualistic model of the mind separate from the body. And we use this diagram a lot. I created this diagram as we've been teaching about FND. And it's this diagram of kind of the psychiatric or emotional mind and then the neurologic brain. And it has been thought that these are totally separate things, which seems ridiculous because they really both live in the same organ. They talk to each other in the same circuitry. And so this is really a false dichotomy, a false dualism of the brain and the mind. And this is false in many disorders, by the way, but very much this leads to the stigma in FND that these are separate pieces and there's this disembodied mind. We understand, and the neuroscience informs us in functional neurologic disorders, that these are not separate, but together as a neuropsychiatric condition. And FND is not the only neuropsychiatric condition. So this stigma and this understanding of this dualism are really important to acknowledge in the context of the inequities that we see in functional neurologic disorder. So that is really, really important. By the way, I highly recommend the article if you want to look at, they then go through how common FND is misdiagnosed. Not very common. How stable it is when somebody makes a diagnosis. It's a very stable diagnosis, meaning it doesn't then change to a different diagnosis. So they go through all of those pieces. They go through the neuroscience that of the let me put the right word to it. The neuroscience that shows, the studies that show that it's not faking or making up symptoms. So, by the way, I highly recommend the article in case you didn't realize. I think the other thing that's really dated and stigmatizing is that this historical understanding that this was purely a conversion disorder, that this was a underlying traumatic experience that was converted to a bodily experience, which also, by the way, kind of feeds into this dualistic piece. And that is also dated. The theories are dated and really not how FND is currently understood. The neuroscience behind it, the fMRI studies that we have in FND. So I hope I'm making a point that FND is a feminist issue, and they actually have a list of 6 reasons why this is an FND. FND is a feminist issue. Number 1, it predominantly affects women. Number 2, historical and societal issues affecting women continue to shape the narrative of FND. Number 3 is the under-recognition of FND, that it's even occurring in men, and that might be due to diagnostic bias. Number 4, sexual abuse and violence are gender-weighted risk factors in FND. This doesn't mean that this is the case in all people with FND, but this is understood in the research. Number 5, socioeconomic disparity exists between men and women, contributing to the inequalities of diagnosis and treatment. I think this is really important. And FND clinical services research are chronically underfunded, which is in line with many of the disorders that that are neglected in research that disproportionately affect women. So it's not just FND. So the article, again, let me bring up the title for you if you're looking for it. I'll put a link in our newsletter this week, just as I always do, but here's the title of it. They then go on to really describe those 6 things. And some of the things they share in this historical narrative really ring true to what I hear from women all of the time. And one of them, for example, I think comes up so commonly in FND is that people are shamed and blamed, maybe even humiliated for the symptoms, for having a functional seizure in the hospital. I've heard just terrible stories of people not believed for what was happening. They also talk through the literature and the history of the gender bias in diagnosis overall. And one of those being that women tend to actually present for healthcare services more often than men, which is true and interesting, I think. Which, by the way, I see many. We treat peds, we treat young males that have FND. We treat older males. So it's not that it doesn't occur in men. That is not what the article is saying at all. But they do talk about the gender-weighted risk factors, which, by the way, they give a really nice summary of how this occurs in different cultures across the world as well, and that it's very consistent patterns of functional weakness, functional dystonia, functional spasms, functional myoclonus, functional tremors, similar patterns across the world in women. So I wanted to end with again, this article is a review. It's a review of the history, it's a review of the research, and it ends with a call to action. And I actually grabbed that here so I can share this with you. Here is the call to action. So I'm going to read this. Again, highly recommend the article. It's so good. This is a call to action. We support and urge careful and appropriate use of this diagnosis. Let's get the diagnosis right. To support and empower those affected by FND so their symptoms and suffering can be recognized and validated. It's a neuro disorder, just like other neuro disorders. We call for respectful models of clinical care. Let's stop the belittling and the shaming and the not understanding, and an end to dismissive and harmful language. Yes, please. And behavior towards people with FND. We call for a shift in an approach to FND and other functional disorders to move away from this dualist model of mind and body. That was the figure that I showed you. So important. We call for a parity of FND among other neurologic disorders in medical education and better training and curricula for all of the people, all the allied health professionals, all health professionals, all people in the world really that have contact with patients with FND. So this is a direct quote from the end of the article and their call to action. So what are you going to do? What steps are you going to take here? And yes, I'm getting a lot of really agree with this. If you have a lived experience of FND, this resonates. You've been there. You've been mistreated. You've been dismissed. You've experienced the harmful language. And I know because I've heard it. I've also been a female in the medical field. I've been a female patient with an autoimmune disorder and have been dismissed and condescended to. I know I've been there. And so this is even more why I'm so passionate about this as a call to action. This is why I share about FND every week. This is why we do a course on functional neurologic disorders for clinicians. We're working to spread the word so that more people can have a positive experience with a clinician. It's really hard to get better when you've had so many terrible healthcare experiences. So we're looking to change that here at Reactive. So we are, if you're a clinician and this is new for you, or you're starting to see FND and still feeling a little confused, overwhelmed, not sure where to start, we're doing a mini course. Oh, here, I can stop sharing this, on functional neurologic disorders. It's live on June 8th. Our early bird ends next week. We would love for you to join us. If you're a person with FND, send them to our mini course. We're going to talk about the diagnosis. We're going to talk about the neuroscience. We're going to talk about assessment and treatment so that people can have really good outcomes and help people with FND. So that is coming up, and continue to spread the word. We share free resources every week. We'll put this video and links to the article in our newsletter every week. Please continue to share that with your clinician friends. We want to continue to spread the word and advocate for these types of actions that I shared in this review article for people with FND. So I want to thank you for being here, for showing up, for learning alongside of me, for helping me learn every single week. I appreciate it so much. And please share this video with your colleagues and friends so that we can continue to advocate for functional neurologic disorders. It is a feminist issue, and it's something that requires more attention. So thank you again so much, and I will catch you again soon. Have a good night.